Hello, I'm Wyatt with XL Ministries, and I have the privilege today to be here with Pastor Tom Pennington, who's the pastor-teacher at Countryside Bible Church in South Lake, Texas. He's also the voice of the Word Unleashed. And then also I have Brian Murphy, who has been a pastor for 38 years. He lives in Bakersfield, California. He also now works full-time with XL Ministries as our executive director. And the topic today has to do with missions and the importance of missions, the importance of training in missions. But I just want to start out, Tom, if I could, with you. Talk to me about your perspective of the state of missions in the church today.
Well, you know, it's a sad state because I think it's faulty on several fronts. First of all, just the idea of what is a missionary. You know, is somebody who's going to go dig wells in Africa a missionary? Is somebody who's into the social justice movement a missionary? Those are questions that are being asked by churches across the world. So what is a missionary? And there's a lot of confusion about that. But I think in an even greater way among like-minded churches, there's a problem with the equipping and training of missionaries, so that it's sort of passed along like a hot potato where the churches say, the mission agencies need to do that. And the mission agencies say, well, the churches should have done that. And so we're sending people to do work that isn't truly missions work, and we're sending them unqualified. Or we're sending them to do what is really biblical frontline missions work as described in the New Testament, but they haven't been prepared, and they're not equipped, they're not trained, they're not qualified. And no one is really doing that to ensure that they're qualified. So it's a really sad state, and we're ending up with a lot of people in the mission field who aren't biblically qualified to be there, and they aren't doing biblically identifiable missions.
So, Brian, just following up on that, I know you served on the board for Radius International for many, many years.
Yes.
I also know that you've been involved in training missionaries, and especially you have a heart for unreached people groups. So as you consider what Tom has shared and just the state of missions, what would be your evaluation?
Yeah, well, I completely, of course, agree with what Tom said. And, to be honest, for many years, in my 38 years, I would have been there as a senior pastor, where I also put missions as what I would say extra credit. I focused on, discipleship in my church and evangelism in our neighborhoods, and, raising up a staff. And missions was, whatever money was left over, whatever resources were left over. Through my own study of the scriptures and other things that came to understand, it was really not, Jesus's perspective on missions, and certainly not the Great Commission for missions. And very thankful to have spent time at Radius with some great guys at Radius that I can't speak more highly of, with, such a great training organization. And but I do agree that the state of the church is sorely lacking in both training missionaries to go to the field, and then just sort of guiding them on where to go. How do we take a person that comes to us and says, Pastor Tom or Pastor Brian, I want to be a missionary. Now what? And typically the church has said, well, do you have a gift of evangelism? Can you breathe? And here's the plane ticket, and we'll give you $50. And man, that is so lacking in what needs to happen to get a missionary from there. Again, if we're going to define missionary as we would, a frontline missionary taking the gospel, going to plant a church, maybe hopefully in an unreached people group. If they're going to go over there and do IT, which we need, but I wouldn't necessarily call them a missionary, but if they're going to go over there and do frontline work, there's a lot of things that need to happen besides giving them a plane ticket to get them there.
And maybe for the sake of this discussion, let's narrow the definition of missionary, because I do think with good intentions, we've broadened that to such an extent, technology, somebody, secretarial or administration, and people are raising support for every different type of thing that is in some way associated with missions. But Tom, if you were to just define missionary, if you will, in just a more specific way of those that are going out, how would you define that?
Well, I would look at the two key places in the New Testament where I think that definition can be developed. One of those is the Great Commission. When you look at the Great Commission, most people think it's purely one-on-one evangelism. That's simply not true. The Great Commission includes making disciples, but it also includes baptizing them and teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. That means that churches are at the center of the Great Commission because those things happen in the life of the church. And so the instruction Christ gave, he said in Matthew 16, I will build my church. Well, in Matthew 28, he tells us how. Mm-hmm. The Great Commission is really just the how of I will build my church. And it happens when existing churches send qualified, trained, and gifted men to go and to plant, to evangelize, to plant, and to strengthen churches so that they in turn can do the Great Commission again. They can repeat that and carry it out. Now, there are those, of course, who come along to support that missionary endeavor, whether it's pilots or translators or IT or whatever it might be. It's not that they're unimportant, but we need to see them for what they are. They're there to support the missionary endeavor. And the key missionary endeavor has to do with planting and strengthening local churches.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in relationship to that, you've said and put in writing, that'll come out, I think, in another year or so, that missionaries who are church planting missionaries must be elder qualified as well as equipped to train elders. Explain that.
Well, again, I think that's the pattern you see. I mentioned two places in the scripture where you see this sort of played out. One of them is in the Great Commission. The other is in the example of the churches in Acts. Look at the church in Jerusalem. Look at the church in Antioch specifically. They send out leaders, men who are already leaders in the church. They send them out to plant churches, to strengthen churches, and to place elders in place in those churches. So who's qualified to do that? Who's qualified to plant a church, to strengthen a church, and to put qualified elders in place in a church, to baptize and to teach them to observe all that I've commanded you? Elders. So in the end, what a biblical missionary is doing is he is training and equipping elders to serve in that church on the field. So how is it that he doesn't have to be elder qualified? How is it that he can do all of that and not be qualified to serve in his own church as an elder? Mm-hmm. Getting on a plane doesn't make you an elder, doesn't make you elder qualified. And so that needs to be settled long before we send that man to the field if he's going to be doing what is real biblical missions. And even those in a support role, I would argue, for example, let's say a school educator, a woman's going to go and work in a school in a place to support that larger missionary endeavor. Obviously, she can't function as an elder. That the scripture doesn't allow that. But she needs to meet the spiritual maturity qualifications that are required of an elder. Those qualifications are not just for elders. Those are for all people in the church, ultimately. The sort of single identifier is able to manage and teach. She doesn't necessarily have to be able to do that, but she needs to have those spiritual qualifications. So even if we're sending support for that missionary endeavor, and not the missionary himself, there needs to be both qualification that's met, biblical qualification, and there needs to be equipping and training.
So, Brian, if you could just follow up with what Tom was saying, as we talk about, one, the specific nature of what a missionary is in Matthew 28, but then the need for both men and women to be properly trained, even theologically, or maybe especially theologically. Explain the importance of that.
Yeah, it's vitally important. You think about, especially going to an unreached people group, often we talk about having teams. Best case, maybe you have 3 teams, 3 couples or 2 couples and a single guy or girl. A lot of reasons for that, but it is important that you have guys and girls. And so we've talked about, as our XL internship, having men and women there. And of course, we would believe and agree that, the women can't be elders, but again, the one disqualifier there is able to teach, but everything else there, they've got to be able to do. And we believe that in XL, and of course, biblically in the church, that both of those men and women have to be trained biblically, theologically, missiologically at that level, so that when they go to plant a church, they're able to do that. The men are able to go plant that church. They're going to go train elders in that church. And the women, you think about that, it's potential and sometimes probable that those 3 ladies, if you will, are the only 3 ladies on the face of the earth that know that language. That's it. And think about one of the couples that we just sent, years ago. It takes a while to learn 2 languages, but they were sent, and there's 3 ladies that are there now. They're the only 3 ladies on the face of the earth that know the Malayalee language. Do they need to know their Bible and theology to train half of the tribe? Absolutely. And so we can't just, and nobody would say that. We can't just discount those ladies. Both sides need to be trained at that high level to be able to really plant a church, a biblical church, and then see that church not just be planted, but then be discipled and established so that their real baptisms are taking place and the sacraments are being instrumented, and that those missionaries are working their way out of a job eventually.
Amen. That's great.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is a fair statement, but it seems like oftentimes people who have not been equipped to even be able to serve in the church here in our country, we send to build churches in other countries.
That's absolutely true.
Is that, tell me, what's your thoughts?
I'm sorry, I think that's absolutely true. We take people who are not qualified here, would never be an elder here, and somehow we have this unique mindset that things happen differently over there.
Right.
And it's easier over there or different over there. And so they would never be an elder there, but we'll send them over there. And we have this unique mindset that if a person can't be an elder here, well, they certainly can be an elder over there. Right. Or they can't be a pastor here. They would never be a pastor here, but they can be a pastor over there. And that's just not true. And again, if they can be an elder here, if they can be a pastor here, then we can take them there. And I would argue quickly, it's harder over there to be an elder or pastor. Unique language, unique worldview, unique, whole mindset over there that is going to take years to learn. And I would argue it's more difficult over there.
Yeah, you don't have the support.
Exactly. Yeah. You don't have the support. That's a good point.
Right. And then, Tom, you have the church, you have the sending agency, okay, and then you have the mission field. It's easy for especially somebody's raising support from multiple churches. So who's really responsible? It's easy for the church to assume that the sending agency is responsible, that they're going to do the training. What's the problem with our system?
Well, I think it starts with the fact that many churches assume something's going to happen with that mission agency that isn't going to happen. First of all, sadly, a lot of mission agencies are flawed and in their both methodology and in their theology. And instead of helping that person that we've sent for their help, they're actually going to be a detriment to their preparation. But even with good mission agencies, and there are some really good ones, they are crying out for churches to do their job, which is to really equip and prepare and make sure a person's qualified before they send them to the mission agency.
Amen.
And so it's the task of the church. And I would say, back to your larger question, what church? In every case, there's going to be a home church. There's going to be a sending church. Clearly, missionaries are going to be supported by a number of churches. But in almost every case, there is a church that missionary is going to think of as their main supporting church, their home church, however they describe it. That church needs to shoulder the responsibility to make sure that that person is qualified to be serving in that role, that they're biblically, spiritually qualified, and that they are adequately trained, that they have the biblical, the theological knowledge. Frankly, and you asked earlier about a problem with our missions, sometimes missionaries, quote unquote, can't even articulate the gospel.
Right.
And so we're not talking just about the fine points of theology, although they certainly need to know that as well. In some cases, they don't even have the basics of a biblical gospel. And so who owns that? And the responsibility is clearly placed on the church that's sending that missionary by the New Testament. I mean, what is the pattern of the book of Acts? Church in Antioch owned those they sent, and they came back and reported. They sent them on a mission. They made sure that they were the right people to go, and then they came back and reported, and they assessed the state of their ministry. And you see, even with local churches, Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:2, you're to entrust all the spiritual doctrine that's been entrusted to you, all of the treasure of sound doctrine. You're to entrust that to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So that's not a responsibility of the seminary. It's not a responsibility of the mission agency. That's a responsibility that the elders of that church have before God.
Yeah. We've lost that in a large respect, right?
Yes.
And so and you've heard me say this often, and I hope one day I'll stop, but the evangelical church, as a general rule, does not typically train their own people to become pastors or elders, lay elders, if you will. And it doesn't train people to be missionaries. And we've simply become in the habit of just passing those responsibilities off. And yet the scriptures are so abundantly clear, as you shared, 2 Timothy 2, Ephesians 4. It's the church's responsibility to equip the saints. So, Brian, a question. So, I mean, when we can agree that most churches probably don't have a good process to train elders, then how can we expect them to train missionaries? I mean, that's just like, it seems like there's a void. And I know that you've been committed for years. You've trained and sent out missionaries. Talk to us about what you've done, what you've implemented that have been helpful. And I know you have folks that are in different places around the world, but your church took seriously that role of training, because it's not an easy task.
No.
And the church, for the church to do it, it's going to take a serious commitment, conviction, determination.
I'm happy to answer it. And, to be fair and honest, I wish I could say, yes, we planted the church. Of course, we planted the church with a missions focus and a goal, a mindset of sending out missionaries.
And that's a church you're in,
yes.
you've been in, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And, and I wish I could say, from day one, we did it right. The first missionaries
Don't we
sent
all
out,
wish that, right?
Yes. The first missionaries we sent out, it wasn't well. We didn't do it well. But we learned a lot. And really what we did, Rocky, was I just thought, why don't we just take what you and I have been doing, and Chris in XL, in a 2-year internship, let's do that for missionaries. And we tweaked it some, but the large part of it was the same. You know, as you just said, Tom, they need to know their Bible. They need to know theology. They need to know now missiology. But very importantly, we need to know their character. We need to know their parenting. We need to know about their marriage. All these are things that blow up when they get on the marriage field. When you get put in the pressure cooker on the mission field, oh my goodness, it's bad. Think about not having support, you know, in the pressure cooker over there. So we then developed an internship to do those things and to really help our missionaries. And I met with them, and I know that's not possible for every senior pastor to meet with them, but we had a smaller church, a church plant, and I wanted to get to know them. But so we did all those things. And I would just add to that, Rocky, that it was it was vital for us that as a leadership, we got to know our missionaries, and that as many people as possible in the church got to know our missionaries. And that our missionaries got to know the leadership, and they got to know as many people in the church. I always said, and I say again in XL, I never want our missionaries to just be a postcard on the fridge. And I'm afraid that's what too many missionaries are. The postcard on the fridge or the postcard on the missionary wall, and nobody really knows who they are. And you know, when I was on the board of Radius, or I go down to speak at Radius, which I love and appreciate, and I go speak to these dear students, and I share with them what we're doing, and I just see in their eyes just this longing to say, I wish I had a church that would care for me like that. But we need to care for our missionaries. We need to train them. We need to care for them. And we need to get to know them. And then, of course, once we send them to the right training agencies, because there are things that we can't train them in a church. So we need to send them to the Radiuses and the Ethnoses of the world.
Talk about what those things are.
Yeah, well, I mean, so we can train them Bible theology, some missiology. We can get to know their character, marriage, parenting, some of those things. But I can't teach them how to learn a foreign language that has never, nobody's ever spoken it before. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to write a language that's never been written before. I don't know how to translate the Bible into a language that's never been translated before. I don't know how to do that. I know how to preach and disciple people, and well, they need to know that. And so in our mind, they need to go to the secondary school to get that expertise. And then they needed to go to, as Tom mentioned, unfortunately, there are far more not so great sending agencies as there are good sending agencies. And that, I think, is crucial for churches. You go through all this process to help their missionaries get to the right sending agency. Because they get to the wrong sending agency, all this training you've done, all of this stuff is for naught to some extent or to a large extent. You get them to the right sending agencies. Now they can, now care for them on the field. They can help them with their translation. They can help them with, learning the language. They can, help them as they are coming along the line, learning the language, and just so important. And I've said this phrase before, you don't know what you don't know. And I've been there, but there's a lot of pastors and elders and churches that they don't know those things. And at XL, we're just trying to help now as we, have added pastoral training, elder training, as we just added this component of missions training to just help churches not reinvent the wheel, but here's a structure for 2 years or whatever it might be. Here's a structure of what we can help you that you can now train your missionary in that sense before you send them to a Radius or an Ethnos or something like that.
Yeah, let me just because we have a smaller church and a larger church, and just say a couple of things that I think are important. And one is that the truth is, if only large churches train people or only seminaries, we'll never have enough pastors or missionaries. If every small church was committed to training, we would have plenty. Yeah. But let me also say that just because a church is larger doesn't mean they're a training church. I mean, Tom, that doesn't come naturally here, right?
No,
talk about that, because that's work to develop.
Yeah, it is. And I think you have to come there, and you understand this. I mean, and we all have come here at some point or other, have come to the biblical understanding that this is a responsibility laid on us as the elders of a local church. And until you get there, you're going to be content to send your guys off and hope it turns out fine. But once you come to the biblical certainty that Christ is going to hold me responsible as an elder of this church to make sure that the elders of this church and those elders who are going to be sent out, those who are qualified to be elders who are now going to be sent out to plant or strengthen other churches in other parts of the world, I'm going to be held accountable for how well I carried out the stewardship of that life and that ministry. And I think until you get there, there's almost a level of contentment and ease with the status quo. But once you really understand that Paul gave this mandate through Christ himself, he gave this mandate to Timothy, the pastor of a local church in Ephesus. And he's given it, therefore, to me. He's given it to Brian. He's given it to you. He's given it to us in our own context to shoulder this responsibility. Until you get there, you can be pretty comfortable, hands off and hope it turns out well.
Yeah.
But once you realize that you're the one going to give an account for how well that missionary was identified and trained and supported, I don't mean just financially, but in every sense on the field, then, once you're there, you can't go back. Now it's like, wow, I've got to take this and own this along with the other elders in the church to say we need to make sure we're not settling for less than Christ's best and his plan. He has a plan. That's where I always come back to. You and I, again, have talked about this so many times. There's a plan. And we don't need to reinvent the plan. We just need to stick with the plan. And I think that's where it begins, is owning the fact that Christ has established this as his plan.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think in at least some number of churches that their satisfaction in missions is how much of their budget goes to missions.
Or how many faces are on the wall.
Yes, and it's not to deny the importance of giving to missions, but the reality is not how much we've given, it's how much we've invested in those people to prepare them for their ministry, and then to have ongoing engagement with them in their ministry. It's easier to give money. It's easier to reach a particular goal or percentage than it is to invest well in training, because training has to do with the sacrifice of your life, if you will, your time, your priorities, the things that you're willing to do. And when we talk about training people to be missionaries or training them to be pastors or training them to be elders in the context of the church, we're not denying that you can use other resources.
Right.
What we're saying is the church is primarily responsible and can't let that go. And that's not going to happen in 6 months. I mean, it's just not going to. You wouldn't have somebody come on your elder board if they'd only been in your church 6 months. They'd be here years before you, and they would go through training over a year to 2 to 3 years, but they will have been watched for probably years before that. And we've got to start thinking the same way. That there's something that's been a bit glorified, I guess, about missions, where somebody says they want to go, I love Jesus, I want to share the gospel, and we go, wow,
we'll
praise the Lord. And it's like, equip the saints for the work of service. So Brian, as you talk about, because you work with us now in XL Ministries, and let me make it clear that we're not selling anything, all right, if you're watching this video. The resources that we provide are free to churches. We give them because we want to help the church do the work of the church. And we understand it's difficult to create all of these things, and we will do whatever we can by God's grace to help the church to fulfill its role in training. But when you think about training and what you've done with XL and helping churches develop training as part of what we do in our ministry, what are things that are included? How long is a typical internship that we would do with somebody? Again, assuming now that the church has known these people, right? And they've demonstrated faithfulness over whatever period of time that is. But at the point you recognize that they appear to be gifted, I mean, what's the investment of time? What do you want them to experience? What do you want them to learn? Bible knowledge, systematic theology, practice in the church.
Yeah. Well, I will just reiterate real quickly what you just said, Rocky, that, in my experience, having missionaries come to me, I have not had one missionary yet that has come and not wanted to go immediately or very soon. Or a lot sooner than I thought they should go. I mean, and you have to appreciate the eagerness, right? But I have had to say, hold on. Here's going to be a plan. This is going to be, one, just getting to know them, right? If they're new to the church, so it is important that we know them before we even start an internship. But the internship would involve, an opportunity to teach them Bible. They have to know their Bible. They have to be able to understand the themes, the outlines, they have to understand their Bible.
Yeah.
They have to understand their theology, all the things that we do in the pastoral internship. They need to understand. And then they need to understand the biblical missiology. What is the biblical mandate to go to the world? What is the gospel, as Tom has mentioned? We can't take that for granted, that they know that. And then I've always helped them understand that in their eagerness to go, or their eagerness to speed up this process, that it was years between the conversion of the Apostle Paul, between then and when he planted his first church. Years. And were there churches that needed planting? Yes. Were people dying without Christ in between there? Yes. That Paul knew the Old Testament scriptures, but he didn't understand the gospel. He didn't understand Christ. He couldn't put them all together yet. So even the Apostle Paul needed training, if you will, and probably a lot more training than these guys are going to get in the context of the local church. So they need all those things. And then again, they need to get to know the leadership. They need to get to know the people in the church. And we need to get to know them before we would even consider them. And again, as we've said, they need to be elder qualified. To do that. And, at the end of our missions internship, we plan on giving the guys an ordination. Sit down and grill him in an ordination. And we plan on giving the ladies a written test ordination. Can she pass all these things biblically and theologically? Because they need to be capable to defend their faith, to go overseas.
And just to be clear, we don't ordain the women for ministry in the same sense as an elder.
No.
But we give them a written test to demonstrate their theological knowledge and Bible knowledge.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it's going to be critical. Tom, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think I absolutely agree that you need to train a person to where if they're a man and they're going to be doing actual church planting, or they're going to be strengthening churches and baptizing, teaching them to observe all that's been commanded by Christ, they need to be elder qualified because they're functioning on the field as an elder. They're going to install elders. And so they have to be elder qualified to do that. And that's more than just meeting the character demands of 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. That means able to teach. And able to teach is far more than just the skill, the capacity to communicate. It involves, we recently talked about at length, and I know it's on the XL website, what does it mean able to teach? Well, it means there is a huge body of informed content of both biblical knowledge and theology, the ability to present the truth and defend it from Scripture, and the ability to identify and refute error from Scripture that those we send need to have more than ever if we're sending them to a field where they're planting a church in a pagan environment.
Yeah.
And so that becomes key, and it just works. We just finished that process with a man here in our own church who has been here at the church for a number of years, involved in ministry, proven to be a faithful man. He's gone through the process of internship. He's gone through the process now of ordination, and he's passed that ordination exam. He's qualified to be an elder, and we're about to have an ordination service for him here in the near future. And he'll go to the mission field shortly thereafter, and he will be able then to do what he's been called to do. He'll be both, we've identified him as gifted by Christ, we have equipped and trained him, and now we can, with good conscience, send him to do essentially the work of an elder as well as an evangelist on a foreign, in a field internationally.
Yeah, so many good things, because when you think about it, it's such a strange thing that we would send people to the field that we've not trained to be elders so that they will have the capacity to train other people to be elders, and yet we expect them to go there and be able to do the very things that we never did with them.
That's right.
Yeah,
exactly. We're saying we want you to go do this, but if we haven't trained them and they're not qualified and aren't elders, then we're asking them to do something they have no capacity to do.
In a much different and arguably difficult context. You don't know the language. You might have to learn 2 languages. You have to learn a culture and a totally different worldview. That's hard here. Now go put those obstacles in your way. That's even more difficult.
Yeah. And let's face it, the truth is that when you establish a process to equip people for ministry, then you also are able to discern those that are not gifted or qualified for ministry. And I think the church has escaped that responsibility by passing it off. And I think you see the consequence of that on the mission field today, where there are just literally thousands of people who have never been equipped to function biblically in the role of missionary, that are out there not contributing to the health of the church, but to the detriment. And so that falls back on the church. And
Rocky, that's a great point. And as we've done internships at the church, we have not seen always the end goal as we have to get this missionary or this missionary couple to the field. That would be great, but 2 things have happened. Sometimes the missionaries have got in it, and missions interns have got into the internship, and their eyes got a little bit open to go, this isn't for me.
Right.
And that's a good thing that their eyes were opened, and they said, I don't know, we just saved a whole bunch of money and saved them a whole bunch of grief. Or the opposite, we felt like, either they needed more time in the internship, which we've done the pastoral internship as well, or we have got to the point where we said, what, this isn't for me. And that's hard. But better us do that now. And again, it's the pastoral leadership taking our responsibility to do that now than we get down the road. And there's a whole bunch of heartache later. But it all comes back to what we've been talking about, that is, that this process is difficult. It's not easy. It's easier to just send a check, put a picture on the wall, and say, well, we've done our job. This process of training is hard.
And that makes it very easy to blame somebody else for the disaster that hits the field. Back to your point, we end up with somebody on the field who isn't elder qualified, who isn't equipped doesn't even know how church is supposed to function, much less able to plant one and strengthen an existing one and bring elders along, because they're not elders. They don't have any clue what that process looks like. They're not qualified. In many cases, they don't have a worked out biblical missiology where they understand what they're supposed to be doing. And sadly, in some cases, they don't even understand the gospel.
Yeah.
So they're just there, in a field, really spinning their wheels. And more than spinning their wheels, perhaps even negatively impacting the cause of Christ in that place.
Yeah.
And
Happens
it's
a lot.
easy, and it's easy for us to say, well, that's somebody else. It's their fault. They shouldn't have gone, or it's the mission agency. They shouldn't have sent them. And the truth is, it falls back on us. Christ's going to hold us responsible, because in the context of the church, He's given the responsibility for that to the elders of the church.
Yeah.
Amen.
Their
Yeah.
failure is our failure.
That's right. Boy, that's so true. So true. If you've joined us for this video and you think as a church leader that you want to be more serious, intentional in training missionaries for the field, you can go to our website at XL Ministries. It's just the letter X, the letter L, ministries.org. All of our materials are free. You can download them and review them. You can see how we develop our internships. We delight in helping like-minded churches to design internships that can be accomplished under the authority of the local church, in the local church, for the glory of the Lord. But you can go there and learn more about what we have, and I hope you'll do that. And then if you have questions or you need help, feel free. There's a contact form. Feel free to fill that out. We'll gladly reach out to you and would love to help. It's our desire, our goal to be able to help the church simply be the church, function in training as it ought to, and enjoy the privilege of serving the Lord in that way. Well, thank you, Pastor Tom. Thank you, Brian, for being here, for participating in this conversation. I know both of your churches are a great testimony and example of what it means to train, and what a blessing that is. And hopefully, even as a result of this video, many more churches that are like-minded will realize both the responsibility and the privilege to train people in the context of the church. Appreciate you both.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rocky.